In the early 14th century, a French princess crossed the Channel to become the Queen of England. Her name was Isabella of France, and history would remember her not with reverence or affection, but with suspicion, scandal, and infamy. Daughter of Philip IV of France, known as the Iron King, Isabella was destined to embody the delicate bond between two rival kingdoms. Instead, she became one of the most reviled figures in English royal memory, forever branded the she-wolf of France. Married to Edward II at the age of 12, Isabella entered a court already poisoned by favoritism and mistrust. The young queen quickly discovered that her husband's affections lay elsewhere, with men whose influence eclipsed her own. Humiliated and sidelined, she watched as the crown of England seemed less a diadem of power than a chain of betrayal. Yet Isabella was no passive victim. Her life became a tale of maneuvering, survival, and vengeance. She conspired, she betrayed, and ultimately she raised her hand against the very king she was bound to honor. In doing so, she left behind a legacy both infamous and unforgettable, the queen who toppled a king only to drown in the weight of her own ambition. This is the story of Isabella of France, the most hated Queen of England, whose scandalous life blurred the line between victim and villain, and whose shadow still lingers over the bloody chronicles of medieval monarchy. Welcome to Scroll Historian. Here we unroll the forgotten pages of the past, stories of power, fear, and silence that history tried to hide. If you enjoy journeys into these hidden chapters, I invite you to subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice helps keep history alive and ensures these stories reach others who seek to understand the shadows of the past. Now, let us begin. A French princess in an English court. Isabella of France was born in 1295, the daughter of one of Europe's most formidable monarchs, Philip IV, the Iron King of France. From the very beginning, her life was shaped not by choice but by diplomacy. As a child, she was betrothed to Edward of Caernarfon, heir to the English throne. The union was meant to be a bond of peace between two kingdoms, whose rivalry often spilled into war. For France, Isabella was a political gift. For England, she was a symbol of alliance. For Isabella herself, she was little more than a bargaining chip. At 12 years old, she crossed the Channel to marry Edward II, a man twice her age. The ceremony, rich with pageantry, cloaked the uncomfortable truth. The young bride was entering a hostile world. England's court was divided, its nobility restless, and her new husband's affections already claimed by another, Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight whose influence over Edward was both personal and political. From the first days of her marriage, Isabella felt the sting of neglect. The lavish gifts and honours that should have been showered upon a queen were instead heaped upon Gaveston. Edward flaunted his favouritism, making little effort to conceal his devotion. The court whispered, the barons seethed, and Isabella, isolated in a foreign land, learned quickly that she had little control over her own crown. Yet Isabella was not without resources. She carried with her the pride and training of a Capetian princess. Her lineage gave her both dignity and determination. Though young, she possessed a sharp mind and a resilience forged in her father's ruthless court. If Edward thought his bride would remain a silent ornament, he underestimated her. Already, in the shadows of her first years as queen, Isabella's will began to harden. Edward's open devotion to Gaveston became more than a private insult. It was a public humiliation for Isabella. At feasts, the king would sit Gaveston beside him, while Isabella was left in the shadows. Costly jewels meant for the queen were diverted into Gaveston's hands, and the nobility whispered of a king bewitched by a companion who wielded power far beyond his station. For Isabella, barely more than a child, this disregard cut deeply. The English barons, too, despised Gaveston, not only for his arrogance but for the king's dependence upon him. Their anger grew until it erupted into open defiance. In 1312 they captured Gaveston and executed him without royal sanction. The shock was immense. Edward wept with fury, but Isabella's role was quieter, more cautious. She had seen firsthand the danger of Edward's obsession, and though she mourned the fracture of her husband's honour, she also recognised a shift. The court's balance of power had changed. In the years that followed, Isabella navigated her precarious position with patience. She gave birth to children, fulfilling her duty as queen, and sought to preserve her dignity amidst her husband's unstable rule. Yet Edward's reliance on favourites did not end with Gaveston. In time, others would rise, most notoriously Hugh Despenser the Younger, who would inflame both the nobility and Isabella herself. The seeds of resentment had already been sown. Isabella of France had entered England as a young bride meant to unite two kingdoms, but in neglect and humiliation, she was already being forged into something harder, a queen who would learn to wield scandal and betrayal as her own weapons. The Despenser's grip. The execution of Piers Gaveston left Edward II bereft, but it did not end his dependence on favourites. In time, new men rose to fill the void, and none would prove more dangerous than Hugh Despenser the Younger. Ambitious, ruthless, and hungry for power, Despenser became the king's closest confidant, drawing to himself wealth, lands, and titles that provoked the envy and outrage of England's nobility. For Isabella, the presence of Despenser was a wound that cut even deeper than Gaveston's memory. Where Gaveston had humiliated her with the king's neglect, Despenser actively sought to undermine her. He intruded into her household, curtailed her influence, and stripped away the lands and incomes that traditionally belonged to the queen. To Isabella, it was not merely an insult, it was an assault on her authority and her survival. The English barons seethed once more, their grievances piling high. Rebellions broke out across the realm, each fueled by resentment against the Despensers and the king's stubborn loyalty to them. The land trembled under the weight of civil unrest, and Isabella found herself navigating a kingdom at war with itself. Yet even in this chaos, Isabella revealed a patience and cunning that marked her as more than a victim. She endured her husband's betrayals, concealed her growing bitterness, and waited. Every act of cruelty from the Despensers, every humiliation inflicted upon her, only deepened the well of resolve within her. Though still outwardly the obedient Queen, Isabella of France was already plotting the path that would one day lead her from consort to conspirator. By the mid-1320s, Hugh Despenser the Younger held England in a grip of fear and greed. Lands were seized from noble families and redistributed to his allies. Rivals were imprisoned, exiled, or executed. Edward II, blind in his devotion, stood by him at every turn. For Isabella, the humiliation grew unbearable. She was not only a neglected wife, but a queen stripped of dignity, her jewels pawned to feed the Despensers' ambitions. When the barons rose in open revolt, Isabella quietly observed, measuring her husband's weakness and the hatred that surrounded his favourites. The rebellion was crushed, yet the discontent did not die. England was restless, and Isabella understood that her husband's reign had become unsustainable. Every act of cruelty by the Despensers further alienated the nobility, further isolating the king, and further opening a path for her own designs. Her resentment hardened into resolve. Isabella's public role was one of patience and submission, but privately she began to build connections that would one day fuel her defiance. She cultivated sympathy among the oppressed, and her beauty, intelligence, and royal birth gave her the credibility to become a figure of hope for those weary of Edward's tyranny. The Queen of England was no longer merely a neglected bride. She was becoming something far more dangerous, a woman willing to conspire against her husband, to wield betrayal as a weapon, and to claim her place in history not as victim, but as avenger, a queen in defiance. In 1325, Isabella found her opportunity. With England's conflicts against France intensifying, Edward II reluctantly agreed to send her across the Channel to negotiate with her brother, King Charles IV of France. What was intended as a diplomatic mission became the Queen's escape. Once in Paris, Isabella shed the role of obedient consort and stepped into the role of political actor in her own right. The French court welcomed her with sympathy. They knew of her humiliation at the hands of the Despensers and the king who adored them. In Paris, Isabella was no longer a neglected queen. She was a royal daughter returned to her homeland, a woman wronged and deserving of dignity. Surrounded by the grandeur of her father's legacy, Isabella rediscovered her power. It was during this exile that Isabella's life took its most scandalous turn. She entered into an alliance and later an affair with Roger Mortimer, a powerful English exile and sworn enemy of the Despensers. Mortimer was daring, charismatic and ruthless. Together, he and Isabella forged not only a partnership of necessity, but one of passion. Their union shocked Europe, for it was not merely love, but a conspiracy against a reigning king. The exiled queen and the outlaw nobleman became inseparable. Their cause was clear: to return to England, overthrow Edward II and the Despensers, and seize power for themselves. In Isabella's eyes, this was not betrayal but justice. Justice for her honour, justice for her children, and justice for a kingdom suffering under tyranny. From Paris, Isabella and Mortimer began to weave their rebellion. They gathered discontented English exiles, secured support from French allies, and forged alliances with men who had once been Edward's subjects but now longed for vengeance. Each letter sent across the Channel carried whispers of conspiracy. Each secret meeting in candlelit chambers brought the downfall of Edward II one step closer. Isabella's affair with Mortimer became the scandal of Europe. Chroniclers condemned her as adulterous and traitor, but she cared little for reputation. What mattered was power. For the first time since her marriage, she was no longer a pawn, but a player. The she-wolf of France, as she would later be called, had found her fangs. In 1326, Isabella and Mortimer landed in England with a modest force, but the kingdom's weariness with Edward's rule worked in their favour. Nobles and soldiers alike deserted the king, flocking to Isabella's banner. Towns opened their gates to her, welcoming her not as a foreign invader but as a liberator. The queen who had once been humiliated was now hailed as the hope of England. Edward II fled, abandoned by nearly all save the hated Despensers. It was a collapse without precedent, a king undone not by foreign armies but by his own people and by the wife he had spurned. Isabella's triumph was swift, her vengeance decisive. At last, the neglected bride had brought a kingdom to its knees, the fall of a king. Edward II's flight from his queen's advancing forces was pitiful. Once King of England, he wandered with Hugh Despenser the Younger, clinging to the hope that loyalty might yet save him. But Isabella's campaign was relentless, and her alliances too strong. Within weeks, Edward's support collapsed. Captured and humiliated, he was dragged back in chains, no longer monarch but prisoner. For Isabella, the triumph was intoxicating. The queen who had once been sidelined and ridiculed now held her husband's fate in her hands. Hugh Despenser was shown no mercy. He was paraded before the people, subjected to a gruesome execution that satisfied the bloodlust of nobles and commoners alike. To Isabella, it was the final vindication. The man who had stolen her honour and her authority was destroyed. Edward's fate was more delicate. Though deposed, he was still an anointed king, and to kill him outright risked offending both God and politics. Isabella and Mortimer placed the crown upon the head of her teenage son, Edward III, while they themselves ruled as regents. England bowed to its new power, a queen mother and her lover governing in the name of a boy king. Yet in the shadows, Edward II lingered. Confined to Berkeley Castle, he was a living threat, a figure around whom discontented nobles might rally. For Isabella, the danger of his existence gnawed at her triumph. To secure her power, she would have to ensure that her husband's voice was silenced forever. Edward II's imprisonment was shrouded in secrecy, but rumours spread like wildfire across England. Whispers told of a fallen king subjected to humiliation, of plots within Berkeley Castle, and of a queen and her lover who could not rest while he still breathed. For Isabella, his existence was a shadow over her newfound power, a reminder that her authority was only secure if no one could raise Edward as a banner against her. In September 1327, the news broke. Edward II was dead. The official story spoke of natural causes, but few believed it. Chroniclers claimed darker methods, a murder carried out with cruel precision, designed to leave no visible mark of violence upon his body. The horror of such tales fed Isabella's growing reputation as the she-wolf of France, a queen who had conspired in her husband's downfall and his death. Isabella and Mortimer stood at the height of their power. They ruled in the name of the young Edward III, dispensing lands, titles and wealth as though the kingdom were theirs to divide. The Queen wore her triumph openly, reveling in the courtly splendor once denied her. Yet power gained through betrayal breeds resentment, and soon their arrogance stirred the same hatred that had doomed Edward II. The people who had welcomed Isabella as a liberator began to murmur against her. Nobles resented Mortimer's unchecked ambition, and whispers reached the ears of her son, who was growing into his own kingship. Isabella, who had risen from neglected queen to regent of England, was now in danger of being consumed by the very storm she had unleashed. The she-wolf's fall. For a brief moment, Isabella of France stood as the most powerful woman in Europe. She had deposed a king, executed her enemies, and ruled in the name of her son. Yet power born from scandal is fragile, and Isabella's partnership with Roger Mortimer soon drew the same hatred once directed at Edward II and the Despensers. Their rule was marked by greed, arrogance, and the open display of their illicit bond. Mortimer grasped at lands and titles with reckless ambition, enriching himself at the expense of the nobility. Isabella, draped in finery and enjoying the privileges of sovereignty, seemed blind to the resentment simmering around her. To the people, she was no longer the avenging queen, but a tyrant's companion. The nobility muttered that England had exchanged one corruption for another. Her son Edward III, now a teenager, watched with growing unease as his mother and Mortimer wielded his crown as their own. The boy king, once pliant, began to feel the stirrings of independence. He saw that his kingdom was slipping further into discontent and that his own authority was overshadowed by his mother's lover. In silence, he began to plan. Isabella had clawed her way to power through betrayal and scandal, but she failed to recognize how quickly the wheel of fortune turns. Just as she had once unseated her husband, she now stood vulnerable to the ambition of her son. The queen who had defied kings was about to learn that no throne rests secure forever. In October 1330, the reckoning arrived. Edward III, now 17, struck decisively. With a band of loyal supporters, he stormed Nottingham Castle, where Mortimer and Isabella were lodged. The young king seized Mortimer in the night, dragging him before his council on charges of treason, usurpation, and the murder of Edward II. Isabella, once triumphant, was powerless to intervene. The son she had placed on the throne now turned the weight of justice against her. Mortimer's fate was swift. He was condemned and executed, his body displayed as a warning to those who would overreach. For Isabella, the fall was less brutal but no less devastating. Stripped of authority, she was confined to her estates, her wealth curtailed, her influence destroyed. The queen who had once ruled England in fire and scandal now lived in the quiet shadow of disgrace. Though Edward III did not consign her to the executioner's block, the judgment was clear. Isabella was to be remembered not as a noble regent, but as the she-wolf of France, the queen who betrayed her king and paid the price in shame. She lived the remainder of her life in relative comfort, yet under the unyielding weight of infamy. When she died in 1358, Isabella was buried with royal honours, but her legacy remained poisoned. To some, she was a woman of courage who defied a tyrant. To others, she was the embodiment of treachery and lust. History has never released her from this duality. Isabella of France was both victim and villain, queen and conspirator, forever condemned as England's most hated queen.